Let's talk about mitochondrial structure and function. Mitochondria are the site of aerobic respiration. So it's in the mitochondria where the energy carrier molecule ATP is produced. Now, mitochondria are found in almost all cells in your body. The only cell in your body that doesn't contain mitochondria are red blood cells, and the number of mitochondria present inside your cells is entirely dependent on the metabolic activity of that cell. So the more metabolically active a cell is, the more mitochondria you might expect to find there. So for instance, one of the most metabolically active cells in our body is the liver, and liver cells contain around 2,000 mitochondria. So let's have a look at the structure of the mitochondria. So if we were to just look at a mitochondria, we might see that it looked like this. And if we were to cut it down the middle, so we were to cut it longitudinally down the middle, we would see that inside it has an internal infolded membrane. And you will already know that most organelles inside your cell have a double membrane. And whenever we see an infolded membrane, whenever we see this sort of structure, and we see that in lots of organelles, we know that is to increase the surface area. And we might want to increase the surface area to for the attachment of more enzymes or the attachment of more carrier proteins, or we might want to increase the surface area to increase the rate of diffusion or the rate of movement of molecules in general across the membrane. So if we were to think about the size of the average mitochondria, if we were to look at it like this, they are between around 3 and 10 micrometers in length. If we were to think about their width, they are anywhere between 1 and 2 micrometers in diameter. Now, what I've shown you here is a longitudinal view. So I've cut it long ways, but you could also see a mitochondria where it had been cut transversely. So if we were to imagine it had been cut like this. So if we looked at mitochondria that had been cut like this, we would expect it to look like this. So if you look at an electron micrograph of a cell and you see something that looks like this or something that looks like this, you're actually looking at the same organelle, just looking at it from two very different viewpoints. And that's always something to bear in mind when looking at electron micrographs, is you've got to think about the angle at which the cell was cut. So let's look at the structure here of the mitochondria. So here we've got our outer mitochondrial membrane, we've got our intermembranal space, and we've got our inner mitochondrial membrane. The fluid inside the membrane is known as the matrix. Now, all organelles in your body, in your cell, will have fluid on the inside that's actually very, very similar to the cytoplasm, but it will have its own composition based on the enzymes present for the sorts of metabolic activity that's occurring inside that organelle. So if we think about first just this inner mitochondrial membrane, we can see that we have these infoldings. The name that we give to these finger-like infolding projections are cristae. Cristae are the site of the final stage of aerobic respiration, which is called the electron transport chain. So if we were to look at a little bit more detail in here at the cristae, we would see that on here we have got enzymes which are responsible for the electron transport chain embedded, but we've also got these little structures that you see sticking out all the way along. Now, these are sometimes referred to as stalked particles because they stick out, and you can see them often on diagrams, but what they're actually called is ATP synthase. ATP synthase is quite a large enzyme complex which is responsible for the production of ATP. So the final stage of respiration is found here on the cristae. Let's talk about the contents of the matrix. The first thing that we see in here that is interesting is a ring of circular DNA. This circular DNA is not like DNA that we find inside in eukaryotic cells. The DNA that you find inside the nucleus is linear, whereas this is circular, which is the same sort of DNA that you find inside prokaryotic cells. The second thing that we see in here, which is interesting, I'm just going to do them as little circles, are ribosomes. Again though, these are not like the ribosomes that we see inside the cytoplasm. These are 70S ribosomes, exactly the same ribosomes that you see in prokaryotic cells. And the third thing that we see in here is hundreds and hundreds of enzymes that have been dissolved in the matrix that are going to be responsible for catalyzing the reactions of respiration. So I just want us to take a minute to think about these two things. So this tells us something really key about the evolution of mitochondria. Haven't got time to go into it in this video at the moment, but I want you to just think about something called endosymbiotic theory. And this is something that we'll talk about a little bit later on. So we've talked about the structure of the mitochondria. We've also talked about the fact that the number of mitochondria is different depending on the metabolic activity of a particular cell. This is because mitochondria are responsible for the production of ATP, and we know that ATP is the chemical energy, the form of chemical energy found within cells. So all metabolic reactions, all chemical reactions within cells require the use of ATP, and this is something you'll learn about in year 13. So we've drawn these cristae, we've drawn these infoldings, the inner mitochondrial membrane here, but let's just think about the number of cristae. So some mitochondria have more cristae than others, more infoldings, and again this is directly related to how metabolically active they are. So the more metabolically active the mitochondria, the more cristae that will be present, so the more surface area for the embedding of enzymes that are responsible for the different stages of respiration. One final thing about these membranes, it's something to remember about all membranes. We know that this is obviously a phospholipid bilayer, and we also know that it's going to have proteins embedded in it. And we've talked about one of the proteins that is embedded in it, and that's enzyme. But the other type of protein that could be embedded in this phospholipid bilayer are transport proteins, which are responsible for moving molecules into or out of the mitochondria. Just one final thing that may or may not interest you, so feel free to stop here, and that's book recommendations. So if this topic of respiration and mitochondria interests you, I would recommend reading a book by Nick Lane, who is an absolutely fantastic biologist, called Power, Sex and Suicide. Which is about the evolution of mitochondria amongst a bunch of other stuff. Okay, that's it. Well done.